The Green Group of the European Parliament had organized a mission with two goals. The first goal was the Mercosur Agreement. Thank you very much to Mr. Basil, who represents DG Trade among us. He will tell us what's the situation concerning the ratification or non-ratification of the Mercosur Agreement. And we have Jürgen Elbik online from DG Envy, and he will tell us more about the topic that is the focus of this working group. So there was a mission of the Green Group, as I told you. There were three Green MEPs, Claude Buffat, Anna Casavini, who's the vice president of the group on Mercosur, and myself. Anna Casavini was very much focused on Mercosur, and I was very much focused on pesticides. Why? Because for one, Brazil is one of the largest buyer of highly hazardous pesticides in the world. We have regulation about pesticides. So we try to make sure that there is an unbiased evaluation of the toxicity of pesticides. And when they are carcinogenic, mutagenic, or reprotoxic, or when they are endocrine disruptors, they are eliminated. They are removed from the market. And a lot of them have been removed from the market. But the big issue we're faced with is that companies such as BASF, Bayer, Syngenta in Switzerland do export these pesticides to Africa, Latin America. And the problem of Brazil is that ever since Bolsonaro has been in power, these forbidden pesticides have been authorized massively. More than 540 pesticides were approved. The use of these banned pesticides is very much linked to an agricultural model. When we went to the field, to the Amazon forest, we saw the importance of the soybean crops. But you know that. Those of you from Brazil know that. But I'm explaining to the Europeans. In 1 year, there are 3 crops: soybean, sugarcane, and corn. And for that, you need fertilizers. Those fertilizers usually come from Russia. And then you need an awful lot of pesticides. So it's a very intensive, very organized agriculture that brings about the destruction of the environment, and it enhances deforestation. So the goal of the mission was to find out, in the framework of the regulation on deforestation, whether or not imported deforestation, whether or not the products we buy from Brazil are compounding the deforestation issue. And we saw clearly that part of a large share of deforestation is illegal. Then there is extensive cattle breeding with thousands of animals taking part in that deforestation. And then you have the soybean crops with the incredible power of the agro-food industry. And big boats leave Brazil to go to Europe, to go to China. And we looked for the traceability of those products, and we saw that there was no traceability. At the slaughterhouse, from the slaughterhouse, there is traceability, but before that, no trace whatsoever. So if you buy meat from Brazil, it means you encourage deforestation. I went back. And last week, at the time of the elections, I was in Sao Paulo to follow Lula's and Bolsonaro's elections. Why? Because when we went there in July, we had met the NGOs. The NGOs were very worried because they said Bolsonaro is not going to accept the results of the elections. And he refused the presence of an observation committee from the European Commission. Bolsonaro refused the European observers. But there was a delegation from the European Parliament with representatives of different political groups, the left, the socialists and the Greens. And we went to several ballot stations to find out how the elections were taking place. And it all went smoothly. You're really very rigorous in identifying people. You ask for ID cards, you take fingerprints. In addition, the electronic voting is very simple of access and very easy to understand. So we were there at the elections, and I was really very happy, but that's my personal opinion, to see that Lula was eventually elected. But he's got only a little more, 50.4%, as compared to 49.10%. So there is a very tight margin. And we were afraid of riots, having riots on the next day. Well, first of all, Bolsonaro took it quite bad, but he said he was going to respect the constitution, but at the beginning motorways were blocked, and well, we had to leave, so it was not going to be simple, and I think it's not going to be an easy situation for Lula. So the goal of this conference is to try and find out how to limit the use of pesticides. And I'm very happy to see here the representative of the European Commission. We need to find a solution to ban the export of pesticides that are forbidden in the European Union, because we protect ourselves, but it shouldn't mean that we're not going to protect farmers or their neighbors and indigenous people. You know that I'm the reference person in the DEVE committee about indigenous people, because they use pesticides as a weapon. There are planes that drop pesticides, and they fly very close to indigenous communities. So the goal today was, first of all, to listen to testimonies, then to question the European Commission and the DGs, the DG Health, DG Envy, and DG Trade, to find out what the situation is in relation with the Mercosur agreement. Lula came to visit. When he made his speech, he came to meet the delegation with the MEPs from all over the world who were there, and he said he was going to open up negotiations about the Mercosur agreement. So what's the situation now, and what are the constraints? And we'll have to watch that process very closely, because we have the example of the CETA agreement. You know that there were those add-on agreements which were not binding. We need to protect indigenous people, but also the Amazon forest and the quality of water. Because, of course, water is no longer drinking when it's full of pesticides. So how can we make progress in this situation, which is a chaotic situation, and in which we need the European Union to play a role? We are here to try and boost European legislations to better protect people, whether in Africa or in Latin America, generally speaking, and we're here to listen to your testimonies. So I'm going to give the floor to Greta Kenyong. She's the coordinator of APIB, which is an association of indigenous people in Brazil, and I think her intervention will be translated. Go ahead, you have 10 minutes. I can't hear.
A picture, and then they give their testimony.
Yes. 10 minutos. Então, primeiro, quero cumprimentar a todos e a todas. Eu faço cumprimento especial e desde já agradeço por essa audiência.
I would like to greet you and thank you for taking part in this working group, which is essential within the European Parliament to address the issue of the Mercosur agreement between Brazil and the European Union. For us, it is nothing new. For us indigenous people, this agreement is not a win-win situation. Only corporations here benefit from that agreement. We are in a difficult time. After 4 years of bad policies, all the environmental organizations and all the associations active in the field of environment were attacked by the Brazilian state. And now, first of all, we want to strengthen our struggle against the invasion of our territories and against deforestation and against pesticides. You may know or not that Brazil is large GMO soy producer, which largely depends on the use of pesticides which are banned from other countries. But in Brazil, these pesticides are freely sold and used. There are many similar situations in Brazil. Not only the Amazon forest, other forests, other places in Brazil are witnessing the same issues. Because the world now is asking us to be accountable, is asking the Brazilian state to be accountable for the accelerated deforestation process. But these big corporations, Bayer, Monsanto, Cargill, all these companies that buy Brazilian products are funding the deforestation or the Amazonian forest, and they are also financing all the attacks against our indigenous peoples. And they're responsible for the loss of our lives and the loss of biodiversity, the Brazilian biodiversity. So the European Union institutions and authorities must put pressure on those companies to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. But these big corporations buy products which are produced in areas that are supposed to be protected, but which are not. They're produced there in an unfettered way, without having to abide by any regulation, and this will continue and be enhanced by the Mercosur agreement. For us, the Mercosur agreement is a deadly agreement. It should really be thoroughly discussed, because we're stepping into a very difficult period, and we need to win the battle, because we know what we want in Brazil. But I don't think this political term of office that we are going to live with in the forthcoming 4 years is not going to save the planet. Saving the planet depends on the behavior of the rest of the world. The companies are European. The pesticides are produced here. Where are your laws that are supposed to prevent the production of those pesticides that do so much harm to the population in general and to indigenous people in particular, the Brazilian indigenous people? What are your laws to oppose these companies that produce these pesticides here within the European Union? China buys much more soy together with the United States. But Brazil was colonized by Europe, by the Portuguese. In the first wave of colonizers, the first wave was that of the Germans, the Portuguese, then the Germans, the Italians also colonized us. And it's very important that Europe should be able to set the example to the rest of the world and help us strengthen our social movements in Brazil in order to help us come out of this difficult political time. When only one party to an agreement is favored by the agreement and the other party is actually giving their lives, that is not acceptable. We have so many indigenous people who were killed. More than 300 indigenous people were assassinated, were murdered by agro-business representatives. The representatives of those businesses that are responsible for deforestation. We cannot accept an agreement that forces one of the parties to the agreement to sacrifice their lives. It's an unacceptable position. We need to rebuild a Brazilian state. We need to rebuild our country. And the next, the president that has just been elected depends very much on the social movements and the indigenous people. And the time has come to rediscuss this agreement, listening to the voices of traditional communities and indigenous peoples. Our lives, our health are at stake, and we want to contribute to give our help for each step taken to rebuild the Brazilian society. Thank you very much for this testimony. It brings out very important elements. First of all, if the Mercosur agreement is renegotiated, human rights have to be fully taken into account, which is not the case so far. It has not been the case so far. Very often, human rights are totally disregarded. We have to take into account biodiversity. We are in the middle of the COP27, and it's all very well to decrease greenhouse gases, but we have to walk with 2 feet and protect biodiversity. And we can see very clearly that such an agreement as Mercosur that promotes intensive economic development, soybean production, meat production, bioethanol production, this cannot go hand in hand with the protection of biodiversity. In addition, there is also the protection of whistleblowers. That is an essential condition. A growing number of people are being killed because they blow the whistle about the situation of the Amazon forest. Now we are going to hear Audrey Chambos from the Friends of the Earth. Where is she?
Obviously, Audrey got COVID last weekend, so she's very unfortunate and very unhappy that she cannot join the event here after putting a lot of work in organizing the speakers tour. But I'm going to give a short presentation. So my name is Paul de Klerk, and I coordinate the Economic Justice Program in Friends of the Earth Europe. And I'm just going to give a very brief overview or a very brief highlight of some of the research that we've been doing, looking into the lobby in Europe for a strong EU-Mercosur deal. But first, a couple of words about the process, because probably most of you know, but in 2019, after the agreement was struck, a lot of countries, including countries like the Netherlands, France, Austria, had a lot of reservations about the trade deal, but also the European Parliament was very concerned. And the European Parliament also adopted a resolution that the deal in its current form is not acceptable. The Commission took up that point. They understood that they can't push the deal through at that point. And they also understood that as long as President Bolsonaro is in place, it is not possible to present a credible kind of solution for the problems related to deforestation, climate change, human rights violations, and other problems. So basically the process was put on hold. We've been hearing for the last 2 years that the Commission is talking about the additional declaration, but so far there has been very little progress on that. But this is going to change, but I come back to that in a second. In the meantime, what we did is we looked with some people, some researchers in Brazil, and also Larissa, who will be speaking later, I think, helped us in that to look a little bit at what are actually the powers behind this trade agreement. And it's very obvious that from the European side, there are two main business sectors which are pushing for that agreement. And it's the car industry, because they are expecting to sell more cars and automotive products in the Mercosur countries. But it's also very strongly the chemical industry, because they will hope to sell more pesticides, but also something that is less into the public debate, but they also expect to be able to import more ethanol, which is a key product for many of the chemicals and the pesticides that they're producing. So over the last year, we published 2 documents looking into this lobby. And specifically in the chemical industry lobby, there was another report done by Greenpeace, which looked more into the car industry lobby. Friends of the Earth, we looked into the chemical industry. And we looked a bit at what are the strategies that companies like Bayer and BASF are using, because these are the 2 main companies involved in it, and also the companies that are benefiting and will profit most from the deal. So first of all, they're working very closely with the agribusiness lobby groups in Brazil. For instance, CropLife Brazil is an important lobby platform in Brazil, but they're also working very closely with the influential agribusiness bloc in the Brazilian parliament. And to be concrete about what kind of things are they trying to push for, they're lobbying for increased market access for pesticides. They're lobbying for weaker environmental protection. There's been several legislative proposals over the last years in the Brazilian parliament, which were focused at weakening environmental regulations, but also weakening the institutes that were set up in the past to actually protect the environment and protect the rights of indigenous people. They're also engaging in public awareness campaigns to greenwash the image of agribusiness. They're doing that both in Brazil and in Europe. And then finally, another tactic that they're using is they are financing so-called independent voices to promote their interests. In Europe, they are funding a pro-Mercosur product of think tank in ECIPE, which has been very active in the public debate and quite successful in catching media attention. ECIPE is basically downplaying the risks of deforestation of the agribusiness sector and the risk of the EU-Mercosur trade deal. Also in Brazil, Bayer, Syngenta and BASF have supported 2 million to the Instituto Pensar Agro in Brazil. And that institute is promoting, among other things, pesticides and is rejecting the role of agribusiness in deforestation. So these are a couple of the strategies that European business is using. So the question is then, is it working? Does it bring them anything? Are they successful? And the answer is very clearly yes, they are. To give a couple of examples, the pesticide use in Brazil has grown over the last 20 years with 600%. So that's an enormous increase in pesticide use, and a lot of that is coming from European companies. Bayer and BASF, over the last 3 years, had 45 new pesticides approved. 19 out of them, almost half of them, are actually forbidden in the EU, also mentioned already earlier by the MEP. And importantly also, the Commission is often acting as a spokesperson of the business lobby. And there's a well-known example from Commissioner Dombrovskis, the Trade Commissioner, who was literally quoting Business Europe when he said, and then I quote, that it is important to, quote, shape a more positive narrative around the agreement, and that business can help shaping this narrative, especially regarding sustainability. So the Commission is basically asking business, look, can you work with us to shape a better narrative, because they understand that Mercosur deal is not very popular. Okay, so this is a couple of small, no, not small, sorry, of important factors about the lobbying of European business and how successful that is. We're now in the situation after the elections that Lula won the elections, and we immediately see already from the European side, and we saw it actually already the last 2 months increasing, that the push for pushing through the agreement is getting bigger and bigger again. It's partly also even further stimulated, the Ukraine argument is, I would say, misused also to push the argument that the EU needs other streams of resources, and the Mercosur countries are considered as an important source of resources. But we expect that there is an acceleration of the negotiations. The additional statement that the Commission claims to be working on is going to speed up now in the next month, and some sources were saying that beginning of next year they will come with the first draft of that statement. Once that is there, the Commission intends to push it through with the Parliament and with the critical member states. Our position, and as Friends of the Earth, but we're working in European coalitions, and we're working very closely with our counterparts in the Mercosur countries, is that such an additional declaration is absolutely not good enough. The deal itself has fundamental flaws, because it is basically, the main aim is to promote and increase the trade in products which are harmful for the environment, for climate change, for causing human rights violations and deforestation. So unless you change the fundamentals of that agreement, you're not going to be able to basically restore the negative impacts. So what we are also saying is the only way forward is that the negotiations would have to be reopened and fundamentally change the content of the negotiations. This is also something that Lula, before and I think also after the elections, has been saying several times. The Commission so far has been completely unwilling to do that. And they have been also very explicit in telling why, because they said numerous times, we don't want that because this deal is so good for Europe, which also shows that this deal is probably not so good for the Mercosur countries, and that's also what Lula is saying. So I think we at least for the moment we have the Brazilian government, I think, on our side to argue that the first step is actually to reopen the negotiations. That's what we're gonna campaign for, but that doesn't mean that a couple of small adjustments would make it acceptable. As Friends of the Earth Europe, we're going to campaign on this topic in the next year. This speakers tour is the first step to do that. Our 4 guests are not just coming to Brussels, but they're also they were already yesterday in the Netherlands, in the Dutch Parliament. They're going to go to Berlin, they're going to go to Vienna, and they're going to go to Paris. So speaking with decision makers, with governments, parliament, but also with media and with civil society organizations. So thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you very much. I will step in for Michelle Rivasi for about 10 minutes because she had to attend a committee, a parliamentary committee. So we have just heard about Philippe de Klerk, who has taken stock of the situation about the negotiations about the Mercosur deal. We're going to move with Graciela Almeida, who representative of Brazil's landless workers movement and an agroecological producer from a community particularly affected by heavy pesticide contamination. So she will share with us different things about the impact of pesticides on their community.
Boa tarde. Muito obrigada.
Good afternoon. Thank you for hosting us. It's an honor for us to be here with you today and to share our experience in Brazil. I am going to deal with a specific situation following an agrarian reform in a given region in Brazil, but that situation is actually a daily, something we observe every day. My name is Graciela Almeida. I am specialized in the agrarian reform. I live in the region of Santa Acacia for the municipality of Santa Orarita in the region of Rio Grande. I'm also part of a group of families affected by the use of poisons during years. There were poisonous rains because of the pesticides that had been dropped by air on the fields. So what I'm sharing with you today, as the indigenous communities share, well, small producers that want to make ecological produce go against what multinationals want. Multinationals have agreements with governments through on the basis of too permissive environmental legislations with regard to pesticides and also through tax payments. So that does not allow to protect the environmental common good and the protection of the population. So we are part of a group of agrarian reforms There are other group of agrarian reforms in the field of rice production, but we're also part of groups who do attend environmental fairs. And we are very honored to represent the fair which is taking place today here in Brussels. But we have been affected by poisons. On the 11th and the 12th of November, which is the beginning of the spring in Brazil, well, the spring is the time during which most pesticides are used. During these 2 days, an aircraft that was used to drop pesticides flew across our territory above our houses and gardens and vegetable gardens, fields. So after that, there were other droppings of pesticides in the region. There were other sprayings in the region. And these pesticides entered into local crops. Of Santa Rita and the whole of the municipality. And after that, there were symptoms such as headaches, nausea, red eyes, scratchings, and many of them were treated as cases of COVID, and not at all in relation with what had just happened. And those who succeeded in better describing the intoxication per pesticides had to pay for the lab research that was undertaken afterwards. And then the crops got yellow, or we could see marks in the leaves, and all that had been very well described by the local technical assistants. And after the lab exams, so some ended 6 months after the contamination, so the results, the outcome of the research showed that this was that there had been a lot of poisons dropped. Benfenterine, benfantrine, so all these poisons and pesticides were used above the authorized quantities. And another pesticide was the oleate, and that commercial, that poison, that pesticide had not yet been marketed, had not yet been authorized to be used, and it was the one that was most used during that spring of 2020. So it was a genuine cocktail of chemical weapons that was dropped from the sky on our crops. And all these within the framework of the legislation. So we are actually affected by these collateral damages of that chemical war. Why these pesticides are banned in Europe. The use of these toxical elements affected the small-scale producers. So they experienced a decrease in their income during that time, and they could not actually use these food crops. So apart from and all this in spite of the fact that it was a clear infringement of human rights, and our lives have changed because they have been threatened in several ways. We could no longer live from a livelihood. We were affected by mental and physical disorders, and there were a lot of uncertainties about knowing whether we could go on working from our fields, if we could be able to eat a healthy produce. So the territory covered by the agrarian reform has no price. And the production capacity of small plots close to urban areas is threatened by the use of pesticides and these cocktails of poison that are being widespread. Given the current circumstances, and more particularly given the EU-Mercosur deal, countries such as Brazil still import pesticides, and the agribusiness sector keeps on infringing human rights. So that situation is not only unfair, but it is asymmetrical with regard to the power. And actually the agribusiness does not produce food for Brazil, in spite of the fact that there is a lot of biodiversity, many resources in Brazil. We are actually threatened of starving. There are 30 million of Brazilians who do not eat enough every day, who do not have adequate food every day. Following the scientific research of Mrs. Lombardi, we have been able to realize that there was an overuse of pesticides, and actually more than 2,000 substances have been used in Brazil, have been dropped on our heads, on our fields, and on our lives. And to conclude, I would like to ask a few questions to the MEPs that are here today. How much will the Brazilian society have to pay to consume pesticides? Brazil is the largest pesticide consumer of the world. European big companies such as Bayer, Syngenta or others. What about the accountability of such European companies with regard to the environmental cost that we pay with our lives in Brazil? What are the responses of the European state that allow European companies, so companies of their respective countries, to export genuine chemical weapons? That allow them, what about these countries that allow these companies to export pesticides that are banned in their own countries? How is this possible? How can the European states contribute to protect the people, the food chain, and how can they contribute to the conservation of the very weak and fragile ecosystems that are key and key to allow for life on the planet. So what about the violation of human rights in Brazil? So talking here about the preservation of life, the preservation of nature, of the wildlife that cannot be traded. And against the background of a social and social justice. Thank you.
Obrigada. Maintenant,
we are now going to listen to a third testimony of Brazil with Emiliano Maldonado, a human rights lawyer, supporting individuals, communities to litigate against pesticide abuses, against land grabbings and illegal mines in Brazil. He's also a member of Via Campesina in Brazil.
Boa tarde a todas e todos. Primeiramente, gostaria de agradecer.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank you for giving me the possibility to enter into a dialogue with all of you. It is very important to be able to have a dialogue here in the European Parliament. Given the way we've assessed the EU-Mercosur deal, well, we realize that that deal does not take into consideration the indigenous people, and these indigenous people need to be listened to, need to be heard. It's not just a need, it's also a legal obligation. All the countries that are members of the United Nations that have ratified the ILO Convention have committed to do so. And the 200 organizations that make up the group that we represent do turn down that draft deal, because that deal does not secure the environmental protection, the protection of territories, and the protection of life. We have many reports about violations of the agribusiness sector on our territories. We have many scientific elements that show that we are faced with a very serious situation. We are being poisoned, and these poisons are produced by a majority of European companies. So the European Parliament has to take a clear stance about this, and this is why we are really puzzled about the negotiations about limiting the substances that are banned in Europe, and it's really a pity that it is not on the agenda for next year as was originally planned. In Brazil, we consume too many pesticides, and the use of these pesticides is leading to the weakening of the ecosystems. It is leading to the contamination of our waters. It makes it impossible for the indigenous people to survive. Makes it impossible for small-scale producers to earn a living out of the work, and it's an infringement against the right to food security. And after 4 years of a fully authoritarian government, government that acts illegally, that has to that is subject to the Court of Den Haag for crime against humanity. So it is because of these arguments, because of all that, that we claim for not signing the agreement, the deal as it is now. And following the political changes that have taken place in Brazil, and given the group of the associations that we represent, we want to promote, we want to stand for new measures to be taken by the government that has been democratically elected. Among these measures, we're talking about the guarantee for the indigenous people to be protected. We also mentioned the environmental protection that had totally been disregarded because of a political agenda that actually aimed at making a production mode legal, a production mode that is a clear violation of human rights. And on top of this, the European Commission is also responsible in all this. Why am I saying this? Well, actually, the goods, the food items produced here in the European Union, the wood, soybean, celluloses, cotton, all these produce come from the massive deforestation in Brazil. Deforestation which is highly criticized by the Europeans. 120,000 hectares of forest have been destroyed under the Mercosur deal because of the actions of such multinationals. So these multinationals must be accountable for that kind of things, for that kind of activities. We can no longer accept that the European legislation allows for this. So that European legislation, the European laws have to be controlled, monitored, and applied on the European territory, because the pesticides are produced in the European countries. Is there a difference between the human beings born in America, born in Brazil, or in Europe? So I think that this very parliament and the European countries have signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We are equal. And science has demonstrated that these produce are cancerogenous. So why does Europe keep on producing such produce and keep on exporting these pesticides to Latin America, to Brazil? Do we have less value than European human beings? No, we need to rethink, we need to revisit the position of the European Union with regard to the countries of the South Hemisphere. So the agreement, the deal, should not be signed as it is today, as it has been drawn up so far. The ecological dimension has been totally disregarded. There is no use keeping on debating about fighting climate change while approving the fact that there are still violations, the destruction of our ecosystems. Water, which is a common, basic common good for the survival on Earth, is being contaminated. We have one of the biggest reserves of drinkable water in the world. And the scientists that have worked in that region have shown that these substances, these pesticides, are contaminating the water. So we are actually damaging the survival on our planet. So this year we'll celebrate the 50 years of the Stockholm Agreement, by which the countries have committed themselves to apply the principles of prevention, or the one who pollutes has to pay, and other principles. And so on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Stockholm, we have to highlight these principles relating to international environmental protection. The time has come to make these actors accountable. So they we have to make the actors that commit such crime accountable. We do not agree with the deal. The way it has been drawn up is not legitimate. It doesn't take into consideration the concerns of the people that are directly affected by these production modes. So given all this, it is important to put on hold the draft deal and to reopen the negotiations about the deal. And if this deal as it is approved, it will be challenged, questioned by the population, the organization of civil society, but also from a legal point of view, because that deal is a violation of the human rights, a violation, infringement of the international environmental protection. So we are demanding that these negotiations be reopened. So, and take the opportunity of the change in government in Brazil, and we should open the right to informed consent, and to allow citizens, the civil society, to take part in the negotiations of the deal, of the agreement. Thank you. Thank you. I'm now going to listen to Larissa Bombardi, that we have already heard several times here in the European Parliament. She's a researcher at the Department of Geography at the University of Sao Paulo. She now lives in Brussels. She's the author of several documents about the use of pesticides. She's also a member of the organization Justice and Pesticides.
Obrigada. Eu tenho uma apresentação.
Thank you very much. I have a presentation. So, geography of asymmetry, circle of poisoning, and molecular colonialism. It was a research work that was published in 2021 with the support of the Green Group. And on this atlas, I show you the asymmetry So it is what we call, as you can see, the circle of poisoning and molecular colonialism. In my presentation, you will see that I will try to address these three themes. You can see here a map where the size of the countries was distorted to represent the proportion they represent in terms of global exportation of pesticides. As you can see, the European Union and China are extremely dilated. So the European Union and China are the main exporters of pesticide. They do export more than 30% of pesticides. So they represent more than 30% of the global sales of pesticides. So you can see the asymmetry on this slide, the northern hemisphere very dilated and the shrunk southern hemisphere. Here you can see another shape. It is a map about the use of pesticides based on FAO data, and you can see that Latin America is extremely dilated. The shape of Latin America is extremely dilated. So the European Union sells and exports pesticides. Well, we've heard testimonies confirming that. So the European Union exports and controls the exportation of these substances. They export to Southern Hemisphere countries, especially Southern American countries, and especially the Mercosur countries, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Here you can see the map showing the exportation flows of agrotoxic pesticides from the European Union to the Mercosur countries. More than 50 million tons of pesticides exported from the European Union to the Mercosur countries in 2018 only. So this map represents only the pesticides which are banned in the European Union, but which all the same are exported to the Mercosur countries, 7 million kilos, only in 2018. This is Belgium, just like France and Germany. Together with France and Germany, are a threesome of the countries that most export pesticides in the European Union. Belgium exported a substance that is banned in the European Union to more than 13 countries. It is toxic for human reproduction and for human development. That substance is banned in the European Union, but Belgium is still exporting it, exporting carbendazim. You can see here the example of Brazil, which is the largest global importer of pesticides. It is also one of the countries that most uses pesticides in the world. You can see here a graphic representation where we can see where those pesticides are used. 55% of the pesticides used in Brazil are used for soybean production. Then maize, 15%, cotton, 7%, pasture, that is cattle breeding, 6%, and sugarcane, 4%. So these products are typically used by the agro-food industry. Brazil is not producing food. It is producing large-scale crops which are not used for feeding the local population. And the European Union is one of the main commercial partners of Brazil and of other countries of the Mercosur Agreement. You can see here the comparison of the surface of the territories of certain European Union countries compared with the surface of certain countries of Mercosur. If we add up the soy exports from Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Argentina, we have the total territory of France. So GMO soy, which has been genetically modified to better absorb pesticides, to make them more efficient. This makes us understand much better why Latin America's picture seems so dilated when it is represented according to its use of pesticides. And it helps them take their place in the global economy as agro-exporting countries while they are not even able to properly feed their population. So this is the total farming area of Brazil, and the increase of that area in the last 20 years, that surface has increased, that area has increased by 29%. But the use of pesticides in Brazil has increased by 91% in the course of the same period. So you can see clearly the disparity, the difference between the increase of the farmed area and the increase of the use of pesticides. It's a lot. Well, there has been a huge increase of the farmed area if we take into account the size of the country, but the use of pesticides has increased much more.
Yes, sir.
The increase in the production of soybean is not caused by productivity improvement. It is been caused by the increase of the soy crops area. If Brazil abides by the provisions in the current text of the Mercosur Agreement, Brazil will be able to meet those requirements by increasing further the area that is devoted to soy crops. I have a table here with the 2 pesticides that are most sold in Brazil. You can see those that are banned in the European Union. Among the 10 pesticides most used in Brazil, 7 of them are banned in the European Union. So it means that they have an impact on human rights, on food security, on the environment, on biodiversity. A deleterious impact, of course. You can see here 2 graphs. In the above one, you can see the area devoted to the production of soy and, well, and in the lower graph, you can see the surface devoted to crops for food crops. You can see that soy has doubled, sugarcane has increased by 50%, eucalyptus more than 50%, while beans, rice, wheat, cassava, food crops have only increased by 40%. You can see here that that food insecurity in Brazil has doubled, has been multiplied twofold in the last years. 9% of the population in Brazil is actually hungry. And this is the environmental impact caused by the expansion of soy crops, the increase of pasturing in pasture land. You can see here the community, the municipalities where deforestation and the number of agricultural establishments using pesticides have both increased the most. You can see that in red. Here you can see a map that gives you an idea of the rate of people intoxicated by pesticides per 100,000 inhabitants in each state. For each case that has been identified as such, 50 more do exist. So it's very likely that more than 2 million people have been intoxicated by pesticides in the country. Pregnant women poisoned by pesticides. It is an attack against children, a clear violation of human rights. It is a basic human right, the right to life, the rights of future generations. Because children still unborn are already contaminated by those substances. Babies, rate of babies intoxicated by pesticides, more than 50 babies between their birth and 12 months are intoxicated by pesticides in certain states, more than 50. They don't even know how to walk, but they're already poisoned. Indigenous people poisoned by pesticides. They are the population group that is most severely affected by pesticides. We have heard my colleagues Graciela's narrative. They have been attacked by spraying pesticides. Pesticides have been sprayed intentionally on those indigenous communities. So this is a map that shows the aerial spraying of pesticides used as weapons in land conflicts. So pesticides have been used as a chemical weapon in land conflicts. So this is very closely linked to the way in which the agreement has been designed. So this is an indigenous region. You can see the spraying of pesticides in the center of the picture. You can see the plane spraying the pesticides over the homes of the indigenous people. And that picture was taken by a Belgian guy, Benjamin Genoux, a Frenchman who lived in Belgium. He gave us that picture because he was there. He happened to be there at the time when that community was sprayed with toxic pesticides. So you can see here links where you can get more information and download the pictures I've shown you, the graphs I've shown you. It is very clear that the way in which the agreement has been drafted, the Mercosur agreement has been drafted by increasing the rates of imports coming from the Mercosur countries. The way in which the agreement has been drafted is only going to worsen this asymmetry between the two blocks. So my recommendation is that the European Union should put a ban, a total ban on all the products that are already banned in the European Union. We need a European decision. The whole European Union must ban the exportation of those products. We should not, the European Union should definitely not sign a new agreement that is bound to compound these asymmetries. The negotiations of the agreement should be reopened with the Lula government. We need to have a reflection about a regulatory framework to govern the use of pesticides, as my colleagues mentioned. We signed the Stockholm Convention 5 years ago. And this convention about pesticides doesn't even tackle the real issue. So it's high time we designed an international regulatory framework for pesticides, establishing the same frameworks for the use and the same limits for to exports as to uses. And it's also indispensable that we should consider a gradual phasing out of these substances until we can do without these chemicals, because we're actually endangering humankind as a whole. Thank you very much.
On va écouter notre quatrième invité du Brésil. Luana Anoer.
We're now going to listen to our fourth guest from Brazil, Luana Anoer, who's an economist, and she's the author of a report about the EU-Mercosur Agreement. She's representative of the coalition against the EU-Mercosur Agreement, and she's going to explain to us why we should oppose this agreement. She works for Friends of the Earth in Brazil, and she gives support to the community that has been strongly affected by the disaster of a dam that crumbled and that was related to an iron mine. There are also going to be exports of iron ore that are included in the provisions of the Mercosur Agreement. So she's going to tell us about the consequences of these exports. Good afternoon. I would like to take the opportunity to thank you all. Thank you all for making this space available and for devoting time to this discussion. My name is Luana. I represent the Friends of the Earth Brazil, and Friends of the Earth Brazil is part of the Brazilian coalition against the Mercosur Agreement and the EFTA Agreement, made up by Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Norway, the European Free Trade Area, the European Economic Area members. So this front that has been put in place in the last years is made up of more than 200 civil society organizations. Some of them are represented here. I'm going to share with you the position of this front in relation with the Mercosur Agreement, Mercosur trade deal between the Mercosur area and the European Union. On the basis of the knowledge of other agreements already signed with the European bloc or with other blocs around the world, we can see clearly that trade priorities are prevailing and environmental human rights arguments are left behind. Well, these trade deals have an impact on the climate, on the biodiversity, on the environment, on social life, on the economy. But those who profit the most from these agreements are the big corporations who are going to take advantage of the exportation of cheap products, and they are going also to benefit from the opening of large markets for their industrial products. So the goal of this trade deal is to put in place an agenda that is going to violate rights and reverse them. This agreement is going to revive the colonial mechanisms that keep the dependency of the country on Europe. These countries have important traditional communities that suffer from the consequences of those trade deals, which very, very often and generally imply deforestation and an attack against the territories of these traditional communities. We are against this agreement, of course, but we want this trade deal and other policies influencing Brazil's policies. We are in favor of submitting them to a public debate. There should be a broad access to information, and previous consultation rights should be respected in good faith in order to guarantee the social contribution and the participation of the people who are mainly affected and the first affected by those trade deals. Our second position in relation with this trade deal is that the environmental protocols added to the agreement do not change the neocolonialist nature of the agreement. We know that this trade deal is bound to compound the deforestation and biodiversity loss in Brazil. Increasing cane sugar and meat imports into Europe is going to create logistical corridors, as Larissa showed you in her graphs. And deforestation and the burning forests are going to have a further deleterious impact on climate and the emission of greenhouse gases. Between January until the end of October of this year, 9,200 square kilometers of Amazon forest have been burned, and this can be observed in other ecosystems in Brazil too. So the Brazilian population is very concerned about the environmental and climate impacts of this agreement. So expressions such as promoting sustainable development or reconciling production increase with the struggle against climate change or accepting environmental commitments or securing the cooperative and societal responsibility or accountability. Well, these are nice words, but they are not enough because they do not really impose environmental and climate justice. The deterioration of the environment, destruction of the environment is closely related to the destruction of the non-respect or disregard for human rights and environmental rights. Since 2015, the situation has been compounded, and according to the data of the Land Pastoral Committee that publishes every year a report about conflicts in the field. They record all conflictive events. During the first term of this year, this pastoral committee has recorded 759 events of conflicts about land in Brazil. It's a huge. It means that these conflicts affect a huge number of families and generate a very, very serious violence. So, and 5,347 families have been affected during the second semester of 2021 and the first semester of 2022. 5,347 families have been intoxicated by reprotoxic pesticides. So these figures clearly reflect the increase in the number of conflicts caused by contamination by pesticides. Well, these are attacks against the health of people, the health of communities. Those pesticides contaminate water, food, and food that ends up on the table of Brazilian families. This trade deal will intensify the climate crisis, which is caused by the significant increase in greenhouse gases. There will be an increase by 8.7 million tons of emissions of greenhouse gases, according to studies that have been made public recently. But in terms of seeking climate and environmental justice, these trade deals must be changed. And not only the current one, the Mercosur one, but all the other trade treaties, trade deals. trade-offs concerning multilateral agreements about biological diversity and the Paris Agreement about climate change, well, these commitments are not adequate. They include provisions which are not binding. They are not applicable in such a way that they are binding. So we are the third element of our position is that we plead for a reopening of the negotiation of the agreement. International policies cannot be separated from domestic interests and the impact of these international trade deals on the life of local populations, indigenous people, traditional communities, and local farmers. It is the reason why we believe it is necessary to further democratize external relations. We want more people to be mobilized, and we want civil society organizations to be fully involved in debating this agreement, renegotiating this agreement. The trade chapters must be rediscussed, taking into account the interests of our people. We need more equality, less asymmetry. And the fourth and last position point, we want this agreement, this trade deal, to express the voices of the peoples. We need to listen to the voices of the peoples. We need to call out the neo-colonialism that is suffered by the Mercosur peoples, and we need to make alternative proposals that respect human rights and defend environmental rights. We think that social participation can improve the control of local populations in the Mercosur countries over these trade deals and can guarantee fairer deals. We need social, economic, environmental, racial and gender justice. And for that, it is essential to fight the power of big transnational corporations. And it's only through securing the convergence of social movements that we will be strong enough to resist the power of these big corporations and keep fighting against fascism, colonialism, and guarantee the rights to our people's sovereignty. Thank you. We've listened to all our speakers. Michel Rivasi thanks Friends of the Earth for organizing this round of interventions, and it's a great pleasure for her to welcome all these representatives at the European Parliament. And Michel Rivasi has been very happy to have the opportunity to invite the European Commission to respond to those interventions. We would like to hear the voice of the European Commission now, DG Environment, and the representative of DG Environment and of DG Trade. We have with us the specialist in chemicals. Michel Rivasi was looking forward to listening to him because in 2020 she took the initiative of writing a letter that was signed by 78 MEPs to ask for action about exports of banned pesticides. The goal of the European Commission, well, the European Commission was asked to commit to putting an end to the exportation of dangerous pesticides. It's been 2 years since that letter was written, and Michel Rivasi would like to know what are the future actions you're considering for the European Union to put an end to the exportation of banned pesticides.
Dear colleagues, and thanks a lot for inviting us to this meeting and for giving us the opportunity to present the work that we are doing on the export of of chemicals that are banned in the European Union. Please let me start with reminding that the export of hazardous chemicals is addressed by the Rotterdam Convention, an international instrument under the United Nations. Rotterdam Convention on the prior informed consent procedure for certain hazardous chemicals and pesticides in international trade. So this convention has about 165 parties, amongst those certainly the European Union and all of its member states, but also Brazil is one of the parties to the Rotterdam Convention. The objective of that convention is to promote shared responsibility and cooperative efforts among parties in the international trade of certain hazardous chemicals in order to protect human health and the environment from potential harm. The basic principle of the convention is that importing countries decide via an import response whether they want to import chemicals that are listed under the convention. The exporting countries have to respect those decisions taken by importing countries and have to ensure that exporters comply with import responses. So you see, we already have a powerful international instrument that deals with the export of certain hazardous chemicals and that allows the importers to decide whether they want to receive imports of certain hazardous chemicals or not. And it's the obligation of the exporters to ensure that the decision taken by the importers are met. So this is already a powerful instrument, but it lists certainly only a rather small number of chemicals, including also pesticides. And this is why the European Union, by implementing that convention through a regulation on the export and import of hazardous chemicals, goes beyond the obligations under the convention and offers more protection to importing countries. The European Union regulation applies certainly all the procedures that are established by the convention, so fully complies with all the obligations under the convention, and applies the so-called PIC procedure, the prior informed consent procedure, which I just explained, for all 45 chemicals that are currently listed under the convention. But in addition, the EU goes beyond and lists 140 chemicals. The vast majority of those chemicals are pesticides, for which a bilateral explicit consent procedure applies, which means that we ask the importing countries whether they agree to the import of a certain chemical or not. And if they tell us no, they don't agree, then we do not allow the export of such a chemical. So here we already have, if I may say so, an export ban mechanism, because we do not allow the export of a certain chemical if the importing country tells us no, we don't agree to the import. And we apply this to the 45 chemicals listed under the convention, plus 140 chemicals under our bilateral explicit consent procedure. So this shows that we are already taking very much care of protecting human health and the environment in non-EU countries. And however, since and this has been shown by the various interventions of the colleagues from Brazil, there are still important amounts of hazardous chemicals, in particular pesticides, that are still exported to developing countries that have rather weak capacity to manage them safely. The European Commission recently proposed in the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability to even go further and ensure that certain hazardous chemicals that are banned in the European Union are not produced for export. This is a rather new initiative, and this initiative has also been supported by the member states, so by the Council of the European Union in Council conclusions, And the Commission is currently working on the implementation of this commitment. So we are exploring the available options that are at hand to act on the export of certain hazardous chemicals, and we will launch a study that would be the basis for an impact assessment. So following the rules of the European Union, which require an assessment of the impacts of certain regulations before we can adopt them in the Union. So we will launch this whole process now very shortly with the objective to adopt a Commission proposal that would implement the commitment of the chemical strategy to ban the export of certain hazardous chemicals that are banned in the European Union and towards the end of 2023. It has been mentioned that this initiative is not mentioned in the Commission work program for 2023, which is correct. It's not mentioned, but this does not say that we will not work on this commitment. So we will now accelerate our work, and as I said, the intention is to adopt the Commission proposal towards the end of 2023, and that Commission proposal will then go beyond the already existing measures to restrict the export of certain hazardous chemicals, and is expected to establish a mechanism that would ban the export of certain hazardous chemicals in addition to what already exists. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maintenant, on va écouter.
We are now going to listen to DG Trade of the European Commission with Mr. Basil, who is here with us for the Brazil unit of DG Trade, and he deals with sustainability issues and especially with regard to the EU-Mercosur deal. Michel Rivasi has invited you to talk to us about the current state of that deal and about the future steps for that deal and the different options that you consider following what you've heard today.
So I think I'll start a bit with what was on where we are with the agreement and next steps, and then there's these broader issues that we've been discussing today. And in fact, on the next steps, I must say, Paul de Klerk is very well informed, so it's more or less as he said. So we've been there have been some what we call technical discussion. So there's been a very long discussion on geographic indicators. So basically different traditional names of products where we want to have the list agreed ahead of the formal ratification so that everything is agreed beforehand. We've also been working on what the so-called additional instrument, so a set of commitments stemming from the agreement in the field of environment, and this has come about essentially because when the agreement was finalized, it more or less coincided with an increase in deforestation in Brazil and a lot of public concern, and the Commission of course, recognizes this concern and seeking to find ways to address them in the framework of the agreement, and in particular through further action, not only on the trade side, but political dialogue, also cooperation, all the different instruments. And of course, we also have the what's called the deforestation regulation, which is currently in final stages, which would be provide a sort of a horizontal measure affecting not only imports from Brazil, but from all countries, and indeed the European Union member states as well. Before we would make a proposal to Mercosur, of course, we need to check if it's acceptable on the EU side. So the institutional process is there. We consult the member states in Council and the European Parliament, particularly the Intercommittee. And then we would see what then, of course, the outcome isn't certain because it depends on what the Mercosur side would come up with or propose. At the same time, we've heard comments from the President-elect now, Lula, and also members of his team about certain concerns about the agreement and hinting that it might be open, but it's never been very clear. And I must say, we don't have better information than you have at this point. The team, and I think it's for them, it's clearly they want to understand the issues well before coming to a position. So I don't think it would be. I don't think we could expect a very clear position at this stage until they're well aware of all the dimensions and how to proceed. Of course, if it is reopened, then our concern as a Commission is that there's a risk that basically it's like a construction, very careful construction made, and if you just take out one element, then the whole thing can come crashing down because there's different compromises on different areas, but also the context has changed since it was agreed. So just as many in the room might hope for more environmental commitments and so on, I can see the Brazilian agri-lobby saying, well, you've changed the goalpost now with the deforestation regulation. It's made it more expensive for us, so we want to increase the quotas for exports of agricultural products. So, we have to be careful. It's not clear what would come out of a renegotiation. So that's sort of, I think, the main reason why we're concerned about that possibility. But if it has to be, then if that's the only way for Brazil to move forward, the political decision would have to be taken. So I don't know. That's a kind of very quick summary of where we are on the agreement. I must say I often feel frustrated because the text is, of course, only available in English. So for most of our Mercosur partners, they can't actually read it. And I think that is a problem, and which hinders a good debate with the Mercosur side. But that essentially until as with until the agreement is really everything is nailed down, then it can't be, at least in our institutions, it can't be translated because we can't have the translators working twice on a text. So it has to be the very final version. Nevertheless, I presume that there may be some informal translations of certain chapters, which you can use. Then turning to the other, I think we have kind of here two issues mixed up, and it's a bit difficult, I think, for me to navigate. We have on the one hand the pesticides issue, and then the EU-Mercosur agreement. I presume it's not the objective here to enter into a big debate on the EU-Mercosur agreement and different pros and cons. We don't have time for that. The question is, for me, is the EU-Mercosur agreement a good tool to address the issue of pesticide use in Brazil specifically? I would argue that it's probably not a very efficient tool if that's what's being looked at. If you take into account, for instance, that soy, which we've just been told accounts for 55% of the pesticide use, already comes into the EU with no tariffs. So the agreement is not going to change anything on the patterns of EU soy imports. What may change is our agricultural practices under our common agricultural policy in terms of how much soy we feed to our animals. But in terms of trade, that's not going to change. The tariffs will go down for chemicals. They're currently checked up. They were between around 10 and 12%. So our pesticide exports have a tariff when they are imported into Brazil, and they would be reduced eventually to zero, but over quite a long period, either 10 or 15 years. So these are quite slow reductions over time. At the same time, I think we're all aware that the cost of these chemicals is going up because the raw material of petroleum and gas is also increasing in price. So, you know, the relative impact of these tariff reductions, I think, is pretty limited. So there is an issue, clearly, and it's also an issue, we haven't touched on that here, but it's not a debate which is exclusive to Brazil. Here also we have proposals to reduce pesticide use and a lot of discussion, a lot of vested interests, and big changes of mentality, not only from the industry, but I think also from the educational establishments, how we train farmers and so on. So that, to me, opens up one reason why I believe in the agreement is because we have such capacity on the Mercosur side, and specifically Brazil's side, and on the EU side, to have a real debate about these issues which affect us both. And so this agreement, in our view, would give a platform to advance that kind of discussion and address some of the underlying issues, in addition to, of course, the trade issues. So I've probably forgotten something important, but I'll finish there. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Basile. My colleagues will probably react following what you have just said. I would like to apologize, but I needed to, I had to make an intervention elsewhere. I must say that I'm very much disappointed by DG Envy, because the DG had committed to find relevant documents about the elimination of banned pesticides, and this is put forward, postponed to the end of 2023. So it means that the discussions about the pesticides are also postponed. The discussions about REACH are also postponed. So if there is one message I would like to convey is the following. The European Commission is not concerned because the pesticides do not apply to intensive farming or agriculture. Pesticides is a health issue that affects each and every citizen of the world, and more particularly Brazil, because it's a very big user of pesticides. So there is there are grounds for criticism. But I would like to give the floor to my colleague Maria Arena, Claude Gruffo. Maria Arena, thank you. Thank you, Michel. Thank you for all the speakers for sharing their experience, the experience of their country, and thank you for sharing what you do and for bearing testimony of the resistance of your country. I'm a bit surprised by what DG Envy is saying, and more than what DG Trade is saying, because we know DG Trade, we know the stance of DG Trade. It's a unit, it's a DG that promotes trade, so we are well aware of the arguments of DG Trade. But it's more surprising to hear DG Environment saying that there is already a de facto ban on exports. Because if the country chooses not to receive, Europe decides not to export. It's a very peculiar interpretation of things, especially when we hear our Brazilian friends saying that indeed they are flooded with toxic substances that are considered as toxic on the European territory. So it seems that Europe does not feel responsible for the poisoning of a part of the planet. And when mentioning the International Convention on Human Rights, I must say that it is very hard to hear a European Director General that has treaties. European Commission is responsible for treaties, and one of these treaties says European Union is committed in respecting the human rights as a party to international conventions. So saying here bluntly that as long as we are not prohibited from doing something, we will keep on doing it, while we have all the scientific elements, the scientific basis to clearly demonstrate that these substances are toxic to such an extent that they are banned in Europe. So that I cannot understand that argument. So I would go as far as saying that there could be a sentence, a decision by the International Court that decide that there is a crime against humanity. It seemed that would be the only way to stop the European Union to do what it does. So just before coming here, I was speaking with someone, I won't mention the name. He said he received that the BASF lobbied, saying that if you take that measure to ban chemicals and pesticides that are banned in Europe, if you put a ban on exports, we will actually react by a blackmail action on employment. And the company said, well, it's not that a big deal. Give us some time to organize our production chains in China. And that reminds me of something else, of another story that happened with the Eternit company that produced asbestos. So what did they do? When the asbestos was banned in Europe, they went to India, they relocated there, and they kept on producing panels with asbestos, and they remained profitable that way. So once we say that the European project is based on values, these values do not apply to the public sector only. That values apply to the private sector. And these are the values that we promote at European Union. So we need to take regulatory measures. And the self-regulation does not work, as we've seen. Any voluntary measure with regard to social rights, environmental rights have never worked. What sometimes we show that a small company is in line with principles, but it's always the same company that is put forward, and that small company hides all the others that do not respect such things. So voluntary actions do not work. So there must be regulation. And well, once again, I agree with DG Trade when you say trade agreements won't be a solution to everything. But at least we would like the trade agreements not to do worse than without these trade agreements. Of course, there is trade with Brazil and others. Last week I was in Mozambique, and we were saying the same about Africa, talking about the exports of pesticides that are toxic for these countries. We were actually dealing with the same issues. So these things are done without the trade agreements. But could we do better with the trade agreement? Better than what exists without the trade agreement? So in that case, I agree with you. We could have a trade agreement, but then it should be better. It should perform better than the absence of a trade agreement. but we see that there is no guarantee to do better with the trade agreement. On the contrary, the indicators show that it will be worse. Could DG Trade give us a guarantee that you will implement the instruments to do things better? And then you will rally more people. You will have more people on your side than against you. So that's really what we should do, instead of saying, well, if we reopen the negotiations, the whole construction will collapse. You have to guarantee that it will be better with an agreement than without an agreement. So that's really something we need to look at in the weeks and months to come. But apart from the trade agreements, there are other instruments, such as the due diligence, the accountability of companies. We need to be able to sue, to bring to court these companies, that we need to have instruments to bring companies to court, the companies that do not respect the environmental and social rights.
The question of pesticides does not only exist at the level of Brazil. When these corporations ask us to reject the change of the REACH legislation in Europe, they are transnational corporations. They are not European corporations. They are transnational corporations. They go wherever they can make money, here or elsewhere. So how can we make sure these companies do not escape regulation and do not keep lobbying as they do today in Europe and elsewhere? And we have a huge amount of work to do. And as to commercial agreements, trade deals, they may not be the most interested in tariffs, because the tariffs are very low already, but the deregulation platforms of trade deals are of much interest to them, because they agree to deregulate over there on the other side of the Atlantic or of the Mediterranean, but they also agree to deregulate here and to lobby for deregulation here. We still have a lot of work to do. It's not over, but you must convince us. Well, we need to do better. We need to use all these arguments to convince them to do better. I believe in justice. And I would like to say that France is the only country in Europe where we have banned the exportation of pesticides. The General Assembly passed a law, but they were attacked by companies for hindering the freedom to produce, to manufacture. And the Constitutional Council, which is the highest legal body, said no, because there is a vital interest. It has an impact on the environment and health. So now it's forbidden to manufacture, to store and sell. France is not the country that produces the most pesticides. Germany, we have to hit Germany, then Belgium and Switzerland, because Syngenta from Switzerland, between fipronil and others, there is a lot of work to do. So we need to join forces. And if there is a free trade agreement, because we are not all in favor of that free trade with Mercosur, it's the Commission's work to prevent this exaggerated liberalization of the trade in pesticides. I'm going to pick up on what you said, Michel Marie. Thank you very much for your testimonies, for your presentations. The graphs have been very interesting and very telling. There is a need to do more awareness raising. Of course, we're not all in favor of the free trade deals and all their consequences. And if at some point the European citizens do mobilize against these free trade deals, it's because of these dimensions that are not respectful of sustainable development, that are not respectful of our European health and environmental standards. We have to make sure they understand that the point is not to export dirty products if they are banned on our territories, if they are recognized as carcinogenic, hazardous for the environment and human and animal health. Well, it applies to Europe and to others. we should not remove obstacles to the trade of these products. So there is a need for raising more awareness among the citizens. The citizens should be made more aware of the stakes of the Mercosur agreement. And we have allies at the European level, because in businesses also, because the sectors that do apply the European rules suffer from unfair competition. When farm produce, for example, produced thanks to the use of banned pesticides are re-exported to the European market, these lawful producers that abide by the laws and regulations are harmed, are the victims of unfair competition. So it is one more reason for Europe to ban the re-importation of the products that are manufactured or produced in those countries with outlaw pesticides. So we have all sorts of principles. The do not harm principle, the prior consent principle. We have the European Green Deal and that clear intention to export the European Green Deal. All these are only words if they do not apply to our free trade deals. They are only words if we do not review a Mercosur agreement that was negotiated more on the basis of a mandate given more than 20 years ago, and which didn't take into account a series of environmental and climate goals, but also indigenous people's rights elements and fundamental rights. I think we do live in a totally different world from 20 years ago. And when I hear that an add-on protocol is going to be added to the treaty to make sure that the climate dimension is included in the Mercosur trade deal to address a series of other issues different from those we're discussing today, well, it's more than inadequate. This agreement must be renegotiated if we are really serious about updating it to bring it to the level of the current challenges, the climate emergency and the mass biodiversity loss that our world is facing. In this parliament you have allies, but here you have allies, but in our parliament the number of colleagues from the right wing and also from part of the left who push for the ratification of the Mercosur on behalf because of the war in Ukraine and because of the need to diversify our trade partners, I can tell you that there is more pressure now to move towards the ratification of the Mercosur agreement with an additional protocol about the climate. Yes, but that's not enough. I think that the campaign you have carried out, the support you have brought to Lula in his presidential campaign, must be followed by an ongoing campaign hand in hand with him to make sure this agreement is also reviewed and updated by the European Union. I know it's not going to be to the liking of many people whose goal is clearly to multiply the free trade deals. Trade, we are in favor of trade, but trade should be at the service of certain goals, and the goals of the European Union must be reviewed and aligned to the Green Deal and the Sustainable Development Goals, so we can really speak about trade as a tool at the service of sustainable development goals and the population without further harming the climate and the loss of biodiversity. There is another element I wanted to touch on with you. It's the issue of mirror clauses, because we have been speaking about legislative possibilities, and a tool we need to think about with the European Commission is the adoption of this mirror clause. We need to set in stone the ban on producing and exporting and importing certain products to the European market. It's not protectionism, it's securing a level playing field. We need to make sure the same standards are adopted. WTO statements go in that direction, and I think the European Union can use those international statements. There is a commitment by trade ministers globally, I think will be there is a possibility to use those statements to apply them to the free trade agreements. We need to come back to the multilateral and international rationale, because it's the only way that we can ever hope to have a joint approach. Now, thank you, Satya. Now the last words go to Claude. Claude was with me in July in Brazil in the Amazon. I'm not sure we can actually close such a topic. It's so broad. But I was there, and it's a shock to go there. It's a shock to realize there what's happening. Before going there, I didn't realize what was happening there. But when you go there, you're not the same person when you come back. Well, we foster the exportation of pesticides. We poison people on the other side of the planet. We destroy one of the main lungs of the world. I remember that a few years ago, 10 years ago, there was a French agriculture minister, a socialist, who realized all of a sudden that when we exported banned pesticides to other places in the planet, and then we re-imported food produced thanks to those pesticides, they ended up on our plates after all. So that was a realization that took place about 12 years ago only, and it's still happening today. We went to Brazil, but as you said, it's also happening in other places. We needed to make sure that the products that are banned in Europe do not come back to our plates. That's very clear. And by 2030, the European Union wants to reduce by half its use of pesticides, but we don't know how. And that has not been looked at yet, but we've heard that many times already. In 2009, a Minister of Agriculture in France said minus 50% in 2001, and we had plus 16% in 2013. Well, we are very good at uttering big words, at setting big goals, but it's much more difficult to turn them into a reality. I've been working in organic farming for more than 35 years, and our future lies with farming without pesticides. Now, in Europe, we have a laboratory of 350,000 farmers in Europe who do organic farming. So it shows that it's feasible. So a world without pesticides can be a reality, and it's not a utopia. Despite what we heard with the development of the crisis after the start of the war in Ukraine, and the advocacy for more surfaces grown with pesticides. Forests represent 30% of land areas, and they shelter 80% of the world's biodiversity, and 85% of that biodiversity of the Amazon forest is not yet known. We don't yet know that biodiversity, and these microbes, these microorganisms, these animals, these plants have not been identified. 85% of them are not known yet. So we should bear that in mind too. Deforestation is 800 soccer fields that disappear every hour, and the majority of these disappear from the Amazon forest. It means the import into Europe of palm oil, 25% of the global imports, 15% of soy, 25% of rubber. There are lots of similar figures. Just to say that we have a huge responsibility. We support deforestation when we import such volumes that come from surfaces that have been deforested to feed pigs, which are in turn going to feed humans. So there are many questions that we should ask. The Commission wants to ask companies to check in the framework of a process called due diligence, compulsory due diligence, the end of imported deforestation and ban pesticides. And I saw in Brazil, because we met them, companies who were saying a lot of words on these issues, but we cannot really trust traceability, and we cannot trust that it's becoming a reality.
80% du bois importé en Europe.
And with the wood, 80% of imported wood to Europe is illegal. It has been illegally cut down. And when we ask about the FSC label, they said, in any case, you won't be able to visit the wood facilities because it operates only during the night. And all Europeans import FSC wood and think that it's okay. So when we see such things, we have all the reasons to ask ourselves a lot of questions. I would just like, I could dwell on for hours on this, but I would just like to conclude saying that the Mercosur deal must at least integrate food, raw materials that are not the result of deforestation. Otherwise, deforestation will go on. Raw materials without banned pesticides in the European Union, raw materials that respect the animal well-being, and something about water cycle. But there is an issue with the water cycle, and we are on the fringe of having more droughts because of the deforestation. That agreement should, at minimum, not promote a behavior of settlers, predators. Because when coming back from Brazil, I thought colonization had been prohibited for many years now. We are the 21st century. Actually, when going there, we realized that colonization is still practiced as in the 19th century. They are still hunting for men. There are still land grabbings. There is still such violence. I may be naive, but I thought that it was prohibited, that we were no longer entitled to do that. I thought that Europeans were not allowed to do that anymore. So that agreement should cover the protection of indigenous peoples, be protected from such violence, be protected from poisoning. We've talked about banned pesticides, but what about the golden, the activity with gold? So populations are poisoned. The young between 8 and 15 are largely poisoned, and these people who live by the river in the forest, they find their proteins with fish, and they can no longer eat fish because the fish is in part of a food chain with mercury. So it's incredible to see such things. Now, equity, fair trade, no grabbing of minerals. And then the issue of the corporate responsibility. So there is a legislation in progress, and I am the rapporteur about this. These big multinationals, companies should have represent 30% of their market. In that case, you wait something, but and you can easily damage people and territories. So an agreement that should at least cover basic principles that we have figured. And so if there must be an agreement, a deal, that deal should take these elements into consideration if we want to be credible. Thank you, Claude. Well, you have taken stock of all the conditions, but there is another one. There is another conditionality. What's the use of such free trade agreements? Honestly. At the COP27, the Paris Agreement about the CO2, about the food sovereignty, energy security, about all this, do you think we need meat from Brazil in Europe? Do you think we need the ethanol that comes from sugar cane? Do you think that we need soya when we can produce it in Europe? In any case, thank you for being here. I want you to know that we fully support you, and if there is any problem, we are ready to go back. We're also ready to invite the Brazilian MEPs to see how things work in Europe. We will be able to make progress if we share a common culture. So it's very important to be informed about what's at stake. I would like to thank the Commission to be here, DG Trade, DG Envy, or the DG Health that I have just left. So we live on the same planet, and there must be solidarity, because if anyone disappears, I mean that all the others will little by little disappear as well. So thank you. We are here. Thank you very much for coming, and hope to see you soon. Thank you for organizing this conference, Michel. Thank you very much for that.
Merci aux
And thank you to the interpreters. Thank you. Thank you.